Coach went from a 6-person family-run business making men's wallets in 1941 to a global powerhouse conglomerate in the handbag and lifestyle marketplace today. How did they do it? What were the key decisions responsible for their stratospheric success? What mistakes did they make along the way, and how did they come back from them? I'll tell you all this and more in today's video. As many of you know, I'm currently doing a series on Coach every Thursday, where I go in depth into different aspects of Coach throughout its history. I've really been loving learning so much about Coach, and I'm excited to share it with you and to create these videos as documents for people who in the future are looking for this information. Because with Coach, as far as I've found so far, there isn't one place to go to find all this information. It's very piecemeal across the internet and a few books. So it takes a lot of time to find all this information. This video has taken weeks and weeks and weeks to research, gather information, try to organize it, try to make sense of it, and see the stories that this data tells. And ultimately, what I end up with are more questions. Much of this information I will be going more in depth on in future videos, so stay tuned for that. But my hope for this video is that it at least gives you an overview of the history of Coach as a company and how they've come to be what they are from where they started. And welcome, my name is Autumn Beckman, and I'm here to help you live your most luxurious life within your budget. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss my new videos on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. Again, Thursdays right now are all about Coach. And you'll want to be subscribed so you see my daily community posts. That's where I tell you about sales. Coach is currently having a big one, and they just dropped a bunch of amazing new pieces. I may have picked one up that you'll be seeing an unboxing of soon. So in those community posts, I do sales, and I also do fabulous finds that I come across and want to share with you. And make sure you don't miss my website, autumnbeckman.com. That will be linked below, where you can find things that I've created to help you curate and organize a purposeful collection of your most treasured things. For example, the My Handbag Collection organizer pages. This is the front and the back of the item tracker page, which is the heart of this planner. And this is where you can record all of the information that you would ever want to know about each of your handbags and small goods. Now settle in, because I have a lot to share with you about Coach. We start in 1941. A men's leather goods company was started by 6 artisans in a New York City midtown loft. These early days are where it's most difficult to find accurate information, because you get a lot of contradicting information and a lot of missing information. From what I've been able to gather, the name of the company back then was definitely not Coach. It seems to have been Gale Leather Products, G-A-I-L, but that may not be correct. I haven't found a source that says that definitively. Not even Coach. Some of my references, by the way, are Coach, and they get information wrong too. 5 years later, there was a key turning point in the company in 1946 when Miles and Lillian Kahn, husband and wife, joined the company. And Miles Kahn, who took his inspiration from the hardy yet supple and soft leather of baseball gloves, worked with his co-artisans experimenting with tanning processes and dyeing processes until they eventually created Coach's famous glove-tanned leather. A few years later, in 1950, Miles Kahn took over running the factory. He did not own the business at this point, but he did run the factory. In 1958, the first hang tag appeared, and naturally it was in the shape of a baseball. And at some point in the 50s and 60s, I couldn't pin it down exactly, the horse and carriage logo appears. Equestrian themes were already being used at this point by other leather houses like Hermes, and as far as I know, Coach never had a physical connection to that. Like, they never made saddles like Hermes did, or anything related to horses or carriages, but that idea of the horse and carriage evoked an image of high-quality leather craftsmanship. 20 years after this leather company was formed, in 1961, Miles and Lillian Kahn purchased the business. And it was Lillian Kahn's idea to shift the company in a new direction, which Miles said in an interview he initially opposed. She really had to convince him. But it shifted the company in an entirely new direction that would start their launch into the stratosphere. And that is, she decided to shift toward women's handbags. From what I could gather, the handbag portion of the business at this point was called Manhattan Leather Bags. But at some point here, I never could find a date, the Kahns renamed the business Coach. When Lillian Kahn brought up this idea of moving into women's handbags, she knew exactly who she wanted her handbag designer to be. And that, of course, was Bonnie Cashin. Lillian brought Bonnie on in 1961 or 62. I've seen differing dates on that. And Cashin stayed with Coach through 1974. I will be doing another video on Bonnie Cashin and her time at Coach, as well as the other two lead designers that come in the future, so stay tuned for those. The Kahns set up a workshop for Cashin in the New York City Coach factory, and their idea was always to produce the highest quality leather goods with the highest quality materials and craftsmanship, with nothing to be spared. They wanted each piece to be like its own collector's item. And in 1962, Coach released their first line of bags called the Cashin Carry, which focused on quality and on function, but also on individuality. Remember that we're in the 1960s now in America. Think about the images that that evokes. The fashion, the color, the women's liberation. Cashin's bag designs reflected all of this. They were very different from other bags on the market, and they were a huge success and are still highly sought after today amongst Coach collectors. Besides talking about design decisions, I'll also go through some of the business decisions in this video that helped Coach grow so much. So in 1963, they ran their first advertisement in New York City. In 1964, Cashin starts introducing unique hardware pieces to some of her bags, such as what has become the very iconic to Coach turn lock. And I'll show you an example of this with one of my Coach Cashin bags. This is the Dinky Shopper Tote, designed after paper shopping bags, but made in leather. It looks kind of plain on the outside, but the inside is a different story. We have these beautiful multicolored stripes that were a signature of Bonnie Cashin. And then we also have this pocket with the flap and a turn lock. These have been used on Coach bags ever since Bonnie Cashin first introduced them. This is one of the very first. Throughout the rest of the 60s and into the early 70s, Bonnie Cashin's designs were wildly successful for Coach. I'm fortunate to have several bags from the Bonnie Cashin era, and if you'd like to see those, I will link below my vintage Coach handbag collection. In 1974, Cashin left Coach to move on to other things, and we enter what I call the unknown designer era, because as far as I've seen in all of my research, Coach didn't hire another designer until 1996, 22 years later. They still came out with a lot of new designs during this time, so they must have had designers on staff, but I couldn't find any information about them. If you know anything about that time period and who was doing their bag designs, please do let me know in the comment section below. And while I couldn't find anything about the designers during this era, I did find information about some of the executives and their decisions. Richard Rose was the executive vice president from 1965, so shortly after Bonnie Cashin came on, up until 1995. So he had quite a run with Coach, and he's responsible for getting Coach into department stores. So you know how you walk into Macy's and there's a Coach section? That was Richard Rose. In 1979, Louis Frankfurt joined Coach as their VP of Business Development. And he worked his way up to president, and then once Richard Rose left, in 1995, he became chairman and CEO, and he stayed on through 2014. And there was some upheaval going on around 2014. We will get to that in a minute. In addition to getting Coach into department stores, in the late 70s, early 80s, they started doing mail order, and Coach started gaining more and more notoriety, and their bags becoming more and more popular. For example, in 1980, their bag called the Convertible Clutch was identified as a quintessential accessory in the official Preppy Handbook book. And in 1981, they opened their first flagship store on Madison Avenue in New York City. By the early 80s, the demand for their bags was so high that they had to start rationing what they sent to stores because they couldn't meet demand, because they were still working out of that one New York City factory. And there was only so much space there. The Kahns, who owned Coach, didn't want to move out of that factory. They didn't want to raise prices, even though leather prices had been climbing. They also didn't want to sacrifice quality or materials. And they wanted to take care of their workers. They were already paying $1 more an hour to their factory workers as compared to similar factories in the area. And at this point, the Kahns had been with Coach for 40 years. They were running into these production limitations. They were also taking on other projects outside of Coach. So in 1985, they made a very big decision that would change the trajectory of Coach forever. They sold Coach to Sara Lee. Yes, the cheesecake people. Coach had an annual revenue at that point of about $19 million. Sara Lee purchased it from the Kahns for $30 million. The Kahns took $1 million of that and distributed it among 200 of their factory workers. I don't know if it was distributed evenly. If it was, that means that each worker got about $5,000, which in today's money is almost $15,000. So Coach now owned the New York City factory, the flagship on Madison Avenue, and 6 Coach boutiques. And with this shift in ownership from a family business to a conglomerate with a lot more money and resources, we start to see a huge shift in Coach. In 1986, they opened boutiques in Macy's in New York City and San Francisco. By the end of that year, they had 12 independent Coach stores and almost 50 boutiques within department stores. They also started adding more and more products to increase their customer base. And they started opening Coach stores in malls like in New Jersey and Texas and California, and of course New York. They also expanded the factory to more floors within their building. They added workers, and they extended the work week to 6 days a week. And by 1997, they still couldn't meet demand. So in looking for more ways to do this, they cut their number of department store boutiques in half. Imagine doing that when you're that successful. It doesn't seem like a really great business move, but despite that, and despite that they still have not raised prices, demand soared and revenues doubled. In 1988, they started using factories outside of New York City. Everything until this point had been made in that New York City factory. Their new factory was just outside of Miami, Florida. And this is the point at which on the Coach creed that's usually inside bags, you'll see the made in stamp change from made in New York City, USA to made in the United States or made in USA. And if you want to know more about the creeds, I did a whole video on the creeds and the registration numbers, so I will have that linked below. I mentioned that they started offering more products. In 1988, they introduced silk scarves. These were all made in Italy. They also started introducing more business items like briefcases and agendas. And in 1988, they started expanding internationally. They had noticed at the flagship store in Manhattan that they were getting a lot of tourists from Europe and Asia. So they decided to open a store in Japan and another in England, including a boutique in Harrods. In 1989, they opened a store on Sloane Street in London and another in Germany. And that same year, their annual sales reached $100 million. By 1990, they had more stores in Japan. By 91, they had stores in Singapore and Taiwan. And around this time, they moved the New York City factory over to New Jersey. In the 1990s, they were even more strategic about expanding Coach's product line. And they found that other companies were starting to mimic their designs. So they took a few cases to court and won, including a copyright infringement against Ann Taylor. In 1991, their annual sales reached $150 million. They also announced a move toward more leather accessories, trying to target a younger audience. Does that sound familiar to those of you who have been paying attention to Coach lately? By 1992, they had 53 stores worldwide, and they started adding gift items like picture frames. They also mailed out 10 million catalogs, which at the time was the most profitable of their sales strategies. In 1993, they opened a factory in Puerto Rico. And around 1995, they started experimenting with other leathers, such as in their Sonoma collection, which featured suede and some other textured leathers. A lot of their leather at that point had been smooth. In 96, they opened a store in Hawaii, which was meant to attract Asian tourists. And at this point, it's probably clear Coach is all about expansion. They're very popular, they know it, and they want to take advantage of it. We've seen them expand globally, we've seen them expand product lines, and now they're ready to expand their designs. And we enter the era of their next designer, finally, Reed Krakoff. By now, Richard Rose had left Coach and Lou Frankfurt had taken over as chairman and CEO. Krakoff was hired as the creative director in 1996. He led a 16-person product development team to expand their product line and their designs and to overcome a challenge that Coach had, which is their bags are such high quality, they're made to last a lifetime. We see that with bags that we have today from the 1960s. How then do you get a customer to come back and buy another bag when they already have such an amazing one? Well, the answer here is to come up with more interesting designs. And ultimately, we go down a path of lesser quality. They also expanded to products that you would want to replenish, like socks, or desk accessories, or travel gear that eventually has to be replaced. And with this expansion, they are starting to reposition themselves, not just as a handbag company, but as an accessories company. And they were pretty successful at it. In 1997, their annual revenue was $540 million. In 1997, they started licensing. Their first license was with Movado watches to make Coach watches. In 98, they licensed a phone case from Motorola. And in 1999, I'd never heard of this, tell me if you have, they made furniture through Baker Furniture Company. They also launched footwear, and they launched Coach.com. And then we reach the new millennium, the Y2K era. Think Paris Hilton, Britney Spears, Lindsay Lohan. An era of fun, new, young, colorful designs. By 2000, Coach had 106 stores and 63 outlets. They launched sunglasses, perfumes, ready-to-wear. In 2000, they also launched the famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, Signature CCs. You know, this print. Those Signature CCs played a big part in launching them into the stratosphere in the 2000s. However, it also was part of their demise, and we'll get to that in a minute. The 2000s also saw them start outsourcing production to China. And they became a publicly traded company on the stock market. Around the same time, Sara Lee started divesting itself of Coach. In 2001, they fully divested. So Coach is now its own thing. It's Coach Inc. and it's a public company, no longer owned by Sara Lee. In 2001, they launched jewelry, which was strategically aimed at the gift-giving market. And in 2003, they entered the market in China. In 2006, they added the option of being able to customize some bags by adding your initials to them. From what I've been able to tell, Louis Vuitton didn't start doing this until 2009, 3 years later. By 2011, Coach has 500 stores in North America, plus boutiques and department stores. And by 2012, they had about 300 stores in Asia. Also in 2012, they started doing artist collaborations. Louis Vuitton had started doing these in 2001. Their very first was through their lead designer, Marc Jacobs, when he collaborated with Steven Sprouse for the graffiti line. I will have another video dedicated to Coach and their artist collaborations, so be looking for that. In 2013, their lead designer, Reed Krakoff, leaves Coach to pursue his own fashion line. And by this point, Coach has 1,000 stores globally. And it's this same year, 2013, that we start seeing the fall of Coach. Sales fell that year 39%. And according to a few of my sources, people attributed that to Coach being oversaturated in the market. And in large part to Coach having so many outlets. Before they had all these outlets, Coach was more of an aspirational brand. You could only get their bags from their boutiques or the department store boutiques, and a lot of people had to save up for them. But once they started opening outlets, and the outlets were everywhere, a Coach bag became so much more accessible to so many more people. A lot of people who couldn't afford a Coach bag before could now go to the outlet and buy one. And a lot of people opted for that signature CC because logos were very popular at this time. This was not a time of quiet luxury. So a lot of customers started shifting away from Coach because they didn't want what everyone else had. They wanted something more exclusive, something that felt more special. Despite this, Coach still had 23% of the $12 billion handbag industry at that time. Another factor contributing to this downfall in Coach was that the younger generations had less money and more debt at that time in their lives than previous generations had had at the same age. And fast fashion was widely available, just like it is today. So there were many more options and people were choosing to spend their money differently. In response to this, Coach closed 70 of their stores, a fifth of which were in North America, and they went through some high-level changes. Lou Frankfurt, who had been the CEO, left around this time, as did Reed Krakoff, their creative director. I don't know if them leaving was a direct response to that downturn or if it was coincidence, but it's worth noting to point out that they happened at the same time. What I'm about to say is a bit blasphemous to the Bonnie Cashin devotees out there, but this brings us to 2013 when Coach hires my favorite of their three designers, Stuart Vevers. I know. Can you find it in your heart to forgive me? Vevers had a luxury pedigree. He came from Mulberry and from Loewe, and I will do a video on him and on Reed Krakoff at some point in the future. Subscribe so you don't miss those. Vevers also came from England, and that's significant because of what he did with Coach when he got here. From my perspective, he treated his designs for Coach a bit like a tourist would in a new country. He brought a very kind of stereotypical Americana vibe to his designs. From 2013 on, you'll see a lot of Americana references, some more subtle than others, some more obvious, like the American landscape with the American prairie flowers, tea roses, American suburbia, the American roadside, the American West. You'll also see American iconography like rockets and NASA, and varsity patches. Vevers is responsible for the designs that we know Coach to be now. So if you love that, like I do, you have him to thank for it. If you don't, and I know many of you don't like the direction that Coach has gone, then I guess you have Vevers to blame for it. As an artist myself, I happen to love what he's done. I find his work to be very experimental, to push boundaries, and to take the company in new directions. And I appreciate that. He is also the one who got Coach into New York Fashion Week. Across 2014 and 15, he didn't do runway shows, but he did something called presentations, where he presented his new collections. But in 2016, this was a huge year for Coach. It was their 75th anniversary. They moved their Coach headquarters from that original New York City factory. They still owned the building, even though they'd moved the factory to New Jersey. They moved the headquarters from Midtown over to Hudson Yards, just a few blocks in from the Hudson River on the west side of Manhattan, which was near the High Line. If you're not familiar with that, it was this elevated railroad track that was converted to a city park. And that High Line is where they did their very first New York Fashion Week runway show for spring 2016. I'm going to do a video on the runway shows since the 2014 show. I find it fascinating. I hope some of you will too. I know some of you watch every fashion show. And I just love going back through the history, and all of these are documented on the internet, whereas some of the earlier Coach releases, it's really difficult to find information. These we're living in modern times now, so it's much easier to see what was released when and to see the evolution of Coach, and it's fascinating. So in that very first spring 2016 New York City Fashion Week runway, they reintroduced saddlebags, which were a redesign of some original Bonnie Cashin designs. He introduced tea roses and prairie flowers. In the next show, fall 2016, he introduced the Rogue, which became an iconic Coach bag. And it seems like it was at that show too that they also introduced something that they still do today called Buy It Now, which is immediately after the runway show ends. There are bags available from the show, or similar to bags in the show, that are available in very limited quantities for purchase. That's something that a lot of us look forward to about the Coach shows, is to being able to see what bag is released and trying to snatch one up. Around this time, he also introduced Rexy. Yes, our friend Rexy, as well as several other Coach mascots. I will do a video on them as well. And as far as I've seen in my research, this is the first year that we see a product come to market that demonstrates Coach's commitment to sustainability. And that was through an exclusive collection that Coach did with Barney's New York, where they found vintage Coach bags, they restored them, and then they remade them. They added something to them like varsity stripes or fringe, or something they called rip and repair, which is where they took a piece off the bag and put another piece on and did some whip stitching, which was an homage to the baseball heritage of Coach. They also had a small auction of one-of-a-kind upcrafted bags, many of which were inspired by celebrities. Around this time, Coach Create was also introduced. That's where you can take your bag into a store and have it customized with tea roses or rivets or pins or patches. Or you can have custom stamps done on your hang tags. From what I can tell, this is also the year they did their very first collaboration with a celebrity. It was Selena Gomez. Now, they'd had celebrities featured in advertisements before, but they hadn't worked with a celebrity to help design bags and had that person's name on the bags. So like I said, 2016, big year. 2017 was also a big year because that's the year that Coach acquired Kate Spade. 2 years prior, 2015, they had acquired Stuart Weitzman. And a few months after they acquired Kate Spade, 2017, they changed their name from Coach Inc. to Tapestry. And that marks when they became a conglomerate. In 2019, they had their first fashion show in Shanghai, marking 15 years that they'd been in China. And in 2019, in moving toward more ethical practices and sustainability, they discontinued all use of fur. In 2019, they also introduced the tabby, which became highly popular and helped bring Coach back from that downfall they were still recovering from. In 2019, they also brought Jennifer Lopez on as an ambassador. And they had Rexy on a float in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, which was the first time a fashion house had had a float in the parade. In 2020, they launched an ad campaign with Paris Hilton. This was meant to be a Y2K campaign where they introduced a redesign of the Coach Swinger bag. It was a highly successful campaign and also helped Coach with their resurgence. Now, for me personally, I got back into Coach in 2019 because of this bag, the Coach Cassie. And I bet a lot of you did too. Let me know in the comments below. In 2021, Coach introduced their Preloved line. It had 5 parts. One was the exchange program where you could take a bag in, and depending on certain criteria, they could buy it from you for store credit. And then they had 4 different ways that they created and sold new products to you. One was vintage, where they took vintage bags and restored them and sold them back to us. 2 was they took non-vintage bags, restored them, and sold them back to us. 3, they took bags, vintage or not, upcrafted them, so they did something different to them. They may paint on them, they may sew things on them, and then those became available for sale. Those are all one of a kind. And then the remade line, where they took scraps of leather and other materials and they would make completely new things from them. That, of course, is still available on the Coach website. In 2021, they introduced the Pillow Tabby, another bag that went absolutely viral and helped boost them back up. And in 2023, they introduced the Coach Topia line, going along with their commitment to sustainability. These are bags made from recycled materials and scraps, so made in sustainable ways. By 2023, Coach has become so successful again that their annual revenue was $6.7 billion with a B dollars. And they've announced that they want to buy Capri Holdings, which owns Michael Kors and Jimmy Choo. However, that decision is currently being challenged by U.S. courts, who say that this would be a monopoly. So we will be keeping our eyes peeled to see what comes of that. And that brings us to present day. I hope you found this interesting. Thank you so much if you are still watching, because I know this was a ton of information and a long video. If you still want to see more, remember to subscribe so you don't miss my Coach videos on Thursdays or my other videos on Tuesdays and Saturdays. Remember, I have an exciting Coach handbag unboxing coming up soon. A brand new bag that was just released today. Thank you so much for watching. I do appreciate it. Hope to see you back next time, and I hope you have a fantastic day. Bye.